So hello everyone. Today, actually, I think Kyle might have been the best possible introduction for this talk ever. So it was really interesting listening to his experiences and his thoughts. Because what I'm looking to do today is I'm looking to do a motor barriers deep dive into some of the VR barriers. So before I get on with that, just a quick little bit about myself. So my name is Jamie, and I'm autistic, and I am mostly seen with a large fluffy lion called Lion, and I'm a research engineer on the BBC Digital Accessibility team. You can find me on Twitter as @JamieKnight. Whilst my autism is mostly a cognitive impairment, or being autistic is mostly cognitive, it does affect my physical mobility as well. So things like numb hands and coordination and falling over and things like that. But unusually for me, today I'm not actually talking about myself. I'm talking about a project that we've been running. So I said before that I work at the BBC in the digital accessibility team. And sometimes people would ask what my team does. And I'll say that the goal of our team is to make sure that our websites, apps, and services don't disable people. And then kind of do an awkward smile. And then they kind of do that squinting thing and go, what do you mean, don't disable people? And I get to like lean back and rub my chin and say, well, disability has many lenses. And the lens that we like at the BBC is the social model of disability, which is this idea that it's a combination of an impairment and an environment that results in a disability happening, somebody becoming disabled. Or to put it another way, we disable people when we create barriers in the environment. So as an autistic person, it's not the being autistic that disables me, it's the barriers that are present in the environment, like loud noises or bright lights or unavoidable social interactions. And that is kind of like a key lens that we use when we consider our role at the BBC within the digital accessibility team. We are aiming to understand and eliminate those barriers. Now, with VR, we have the creation of new environments. And with that creation of new environments becomes the opportunity for new barriers, barriers that we haven't dealt with in the digital world before. And in a nutshell, that's how the VR Barriers Research Project happened. We started in late 2017, so it's been a few years. And I think it's the single biggest thing I've ever worked on, which is both really exciting and kind of terrifying. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So in a nutshell, for that project, we had three goals. We wanted to build a data set of all the barriers that we've observed from a wide range of users within VR environments. We wanted to find out if the inclusive design principles covered all of the barriers that we observed. And finally, we needed to learn how to do VR. We needed to develop a methodology, build environments, work out how to put it all in a suitcase, all of that sort of thing. But really today, I'm mostly going to be talking about some of that data set. Now, I'd kind of hoped that by now I'd be able to sit here and give you the overview of the big data set, but there's a little thing called COVID going on, and it's kind of got in the way for us. So there are a couple of user groups, which are users that are hard of hearing and users who are blind rather than low vision. And we haven't got enough data for those user groups yet. So rather than hold on to everything, we are looking at the areas that we're confident with, where we have lots of data, and we're talking about those areas. So there's going to be a bit of a staggered rollout as we talk about stuff that we're confident about as we become confident about it. And that kind of brings us on to today's talk. So today I'd like to do a deep dive into the motor barriers that we've observed. And I'm going to split that into three bits. I want to talk about how we collected the data, a talk about the barriers that we observed, and a little bit of a talk about our experiments relating to switch control and alternative input, because they really help to explain the barriers in context. So I'm going to start with collecting the data. So this has two parts to it, our methodology and our data pipeline. I could talk at great length about our test environment. It's modeled after a school library, and oh my God, there's so many details. But for the moment, let's just park that, and I'm sure there'll be a future talk about that another time. But essentially, we built a test environment which was modeled on a school library. We traveled the country and we invited participants to come and explore our test environment. Once they were within the environment, we asked them to complete three tasks relating to navigation, both like teleportation and walking around a room, interacting with interactive objects, which was books and lights and different shaped objects in the sensory room. And then finally, information gathering, asking them things like, when does the library open? How do you get from here to the garden? Things like that, where they're synthesizing the information around them and understanding it, or picking up cues from the environment. Because if you have an environment that you can't pull any information out of, it becomes incredibly disabling and very, very quickly. And then the last part of our methodology was to observe what happens and just write it down. We weren't there to run through very specific tasks. We weren't there to test solutions. We were there to understand what the barriers are. What are the things that go wrong in the complete picture? And then we'll start tackling some of the bits of it. So it's a focus on barriers rather than solutions. So the second part of this is our data pipeline. So those observations from the data become the first step in our pipeline. They're the barriers that we observe the participants experience. We've run over 100 sessions now. I think, depending on how you count it, we have either had 103 or 107 users, because a couple of users have come back more than once. And in total, over 1,700 observations. I had to transcribe a lot of them, and I can tell you that A, I've learned that I can't read most of my team's handwriting, and B, 1,700 of anything is too many to really be useful and understandable. They also include lots of personal identifying information, so that makes it hard to release as a data set. So instead, we've put together a barriers list. So the barriers list is a big spreadsheet, and it's got all of the observations after we've deduplicated them, got rid of things that are the same barrier but on different, different people, different sessions. We've also annotated them by impairment type and provided a little bit of sorting. There's about 70 of those that we've observed so far, although I haven't finished integrating all of the data yet, because again, we don't have complete data for vision and hearing yet. 70 is also too many to really work with in a useful way. So what we've then done is we've started putting together barrier groups, and this is to take the barriers, to crunch them down to something that is usable. And our aim there is to have 20 to 30 barriers across 5 groups. Well, at least 5 groups, there'll probably be more. And the groups look something like this. So motor barriers, we've got good data for that. We've got great data for cognitive barriers. We've got very strong data for low vision barriers, and also barriers within the methodology themselves. You'll see that we don't have any barrier groups yet for hearing and blindness, because we're just not there yet with the data. But that one in bold, motor barriers, that's what I want to talk about today, because we have a really rich amount of data here. So kind of here goes everything, really. 3 years of work has kind of left up to this point. I think this is the first time we have, well, this is definitely the first time we've publicly talked about these barriers. And if I'm honest, I'm pretty anxious about it. But here goes. I think, based on the research, that these 5 areas are the 5 areas that are the biggest barriers in VR relating to motor impairments. Holding, orientation, press and hold, multiple inputs, reach and balance. And I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so picking them apart and giving you the definition for each one and talking through a bit more detail. So let's start with holding. So all of these barriers, the barriers exist within the experience. They don't exist within the user. It's the experience having an expectation or the experience requiring something that leads to the barrier. So for this first barrier, this barrier occurs when the experience requires the user to grasp a controller and then hold it for an extended period in a consistent location and in a consistent orientation. So this could be holding it for multiple hours, holding it in one point relative to the user, and also holding it upright, something like that. So this is kind of like the first barrier that I'd say that we observe. For many users, simply holding a controller is not possible. And then that greatly disables their ability to get into the environment. So an example here would be holding the controller whilst observing the environment, or holding the controller and having a virtual object being held in that controller and keeping it in one place and the way up that you want it to be. So that's the first barrier relating to holding. The second barrier we define as orientation. So this barrier occurs when an experience requires a user to orientate a controller accurately, and then to orientate a controller repeatedly, and then finally to also point a controller. So let's just break that down a little bit. So orientation is the position of something in relation to its surroundings. For a VR controller, we'd often refer to this as 6 degrees of freedom, which means its position in XYZ space plus its pitch, its yaw, and its roll. If you think of an aircraft, nose up, nose down is your pitch, tilting it from side to side is your roll, and then which way the rudder's pointing is your yaw. So that's what we call orientation. It's controlling these 6 variables. So I've mentioned accuracy and repeatability as 2 different barriers here. And they're a little bit complicated to explain. So I'm going to break this down a little bit and try and explain how these are distinctive barriers. So for example, one of the things that we did is we had a number of users where we mounted the motion controller to a fixed position in their wheelchair. And that led to them having extremely repeatable movement. So for example, if they were firing a weapon, it would go through exactly the same hole every time, exactly the same point on the target every time. However, they had relatively low accuracy because they could only move on one axis and in relatively large increments. So this would be repeatable, but not accurate. And then there's also the opposite, which is a controller held by a user experiencing tremors associated with Parkinson's. They would have very low repeatability. It wouldn't be repeatable. Every attempt would be in a different area, but they'd actually be quite highly accurate. If you took the sum of their shots, and let's say they're aiming at a target and you're measuring how many centimeters away from the target they were each time, it would be about the same. It's just that every shot would go through they'd all be within 10 centimeters of the target, but never the same 10 centimeters. So these are 2 different barriers that are closely related, but are distinct from each other. And sometimes when we're playing with solutions, we can actually make something worse for one set of users. For example, users who have trouble with repeatability, we might actually make something harder for them by trying to solve it, thinking that they have a problem with accuracy. I'm going to probably run slow on this talk, so if I get time at the end, ask me questions about this, because I've got lots of lovely examples. But I'm going to push on with the talk, so I don't want to run out of time. And then the second part is pointing the controller. So pointing is slightly different from orientation. It's to hold something out in the direction of someone or something. And in this example, in the VR context, we have pointing across multiple overlapping situations. So on this example, I'm stood on a train and I'm shooting at a ghost from a moving train. In this situation, I have the real world movement of my hands, the virtual movement such as the train that I'm stood on, but also moving targets to aim at. And it's bringing all 3 of these contexts together in order to successfully point at something. So again, pointing and orientation. Orientation is the skill that leads to the action of pointing, but we group them together when we think about barriers because they're kind of intertwined. So that's orientation. The next barrier, which I'm really great because Carl mentioned this as well, is press and hold. So this barrier occurs when experience requires the user to hold a button down for an extended period. This barrier is also amplified when combined with movement. We had many users who could either hold a button or orientate a controller, but not both at the same time. And we had many users who became quickly fatigued. So to give some concrete examples here, something like holding a trigger down whilst orientating the controller in order to point at a target to start a teleport. That was a very difficult thing to do for many users due to the pressing and holding. I'll come on to some of the things that we played with later, but we started developing latching so that you could toggle a controller on and toggle a controller off to enter and exit different interactions. The fourth area is going to be multiple input. So this barrier occurs when an experience requires the concurrent use of multiple inputs. So this could be pressing multiple buttons at the same time on the same controller or more than one controller, and then concurrent use of multiple controllers. So that's using 2 controllers to do 2 different things, but doing them at the same time, and then coordinated use of multiple controllers. That's when you're using 2 controllers or more to complete one action and they're working together. Well, I'll break it down a little bit more. So concurrent is when they're happening at the same time. For example, if you're teleporting with one hand and you're holding an object with another hand, that would be a concurrent use of multiple controllers. And then coordinated is the effectively organized so the parts are working together. So achieving a single goal with multiple hands at once or multiple inputs at once. So an example of this could be things like climbing a virtual rope or something that we observed very often, people throwing virtual objects from one hand to the other. So we had this big library, and one of the little things about the library that was quite fun was that the library had books, and the books about space didn't have any gravity applied, and the books that are about philosophy were really, really heavy. Because I like a little visual pun sometimes. We had an autistic user who loved these books, and he set up what I believe to be the world's only thrown book particle collider, where he would throw a virtual book from one end of the room and then teleport to the other end of the room to catch it in his other hand whilst throwing a book back the other way. So it was like one person book juggling. And then he started throwing them so they would collide in the middle and then teleporting to the point so you could observe them crashing into each other. I think he's also the user who worked out that you could balance a mug on a floating book and then kind of knock it with your hand very gently and take the mug for a walk on its floating book friend. It's kind of really cool. Anyway, emergent play from behaviors is so much fun to watch. I'm getting distracted slightly. So yeah, these are examples of coordinated use of multiple controllers. Multiple controllers being used to a single goal. And then the fifth goal, the fifth barrier that we observed is reach and balance. So we break this down to say that the barrier occurs when the experience requires the user to reach the objects around them, to reach the floor, and to maintain balance whilst doing other things. So, for example, a user with a balance or mobility impairment may drop a virtual object and not be able to pick it up from the floor, or an experiment or a game might expect the user to be able to reach things they're not able to reach. So if we were working with users who used a stick to help them walk or a frame, they often couldn't reach the floor, and the same for users who used a wheelchair. For a lot of the wheelchair users we worked with, they found it difficult to reach much further than their knees. So we had to kind of design that into our environment after observing this barrier. There's also other types of reach. So there's being able to reach things that are around you. So for example, things might be too high, or again, if you're a wheelchair user, you might not be able to reach it because you need to reach past your own you're sat down, you need to reach further than your own body. So if something is a foot further than your knees, it's very hard to reach. We had some really delightful things happen when we were exploring this barrier. So I'll talk about it more when I come to talk about cognitive barriers, but essentially wheelchair users are experts at not crashing into things. It's a very important thing. So initially in the environment, a lot of wheelchair users that we worked with weren't aware that they could drive through things. So if they came to a position where they would bump into something, they would stop. So for example, be unable to reach a book on the bookshelf. We worked with a user and we explained that she could drive through stuff, and she went, "Oh, wow, that's amazing." And the next thing she proceeded to do was drive parallel to the bookcase and look at all the books. And she explained that she'd never had the opportunity to browse a bookcase before, that she'd only been able to ask for a specific book or look at a photo of a bookcase. But she vastly enjoyed just being able to go parallel to the bookcase, essentially driving through the bookcase, but it didn't matter because it was the virtual environment, and then being able to reach things. So reach is an issue. Reach is a common barrier, and it also affects users who may be getting tired or who may just have trouble with maintaining their balance whilst reaching up high. So that kind of brings us on to this third barrier, which is the users need to maintain balance whilst moving and interacting with things. A great example of this could be carrying an object and placing it into position. One of the things about movement is that movement is also dependent a little bit on speed. So for users who users might be able to do something at a slow speed that they can't do at a high speed. One moment, I'm just going to have a drink. Oh, golly. Breathing. I tell you what, I've got a really bad oxygen addiction. God. Just a few minutes without oxygen and I'm absolutely crying out for some. It's terrible. I should do something about that. I wonder if anybody makes like little oxygen patches or something. Anyway, I was talking about maintaining balance. So when a user does something very quickly, the forces are much higher. So you have some users who will be able to do things slowly that they can't do quickly. So this is kind of what we mean by maintaining balance. It's staying in that balanced state and not falling over. So 2,500 hours of research and 100+ user sessions later, I think these 5 areas describe all the barriers that we've seen. Now, these are just the barriers that we've seen. I don't believe for a minute these are all the barriers that are out there. But I think by understanding these barriers and factoring them into what we design and build, we can build more inclusive experiences that disable less users. Ooh, it's a little bit scary, but a little bit good. So the last part of this talk, I want to talk about some of the things that we explored, some of the solutions that we ended up playing with. Now, you might remember me saying that solutions aren't in scope, that we're just looking at barriers. And that's true. However, sometimes the barriers were so large that we had to overcome them in order to observe the smaller barriers. For a lot of users, they quite literally couldn't get through the front door using standard controls. And we didn't want to exclude them. We knew that there was a huge barrier there that we had to overcome so that we could learn about the smaller barriers and continue to include those participants in our research. Our research was stronger by working out how to overcome some of these issues. So the goal of this part of the project was relatively straightforward, which was to have pressing the switch in the real world cause something to happen in the virtual world. And our approach for this kind of focused on this concept of control schemes. So a control scheme is a specific combination of hardware and software to interface between a user and the virtual environment. So this stick figure user here, he's experiencing one of the control schemes. Everybody uses a control scheme. Your standard controllers are just the most common control scheme, but they're a control scheme too. When we break it down, we think that control schemes have 2 parts to them. They have the hardware part and the software part. And then the hardware part breaks down into various other bits. I'll talk about the hardware part first and then come on to the software. So for the hardware part, we focused on picking the switches, so giving the user a wider range of switches to choose between of different activation types, and then also where to place them, such as holding in a pocket, attaching to a chair. The second part of the hardware is making the input visible to the environment using something like, well, I keep calling it an XAC, but some people call it a ZAC, so the Xbox Adaptive Controller, or we generically call it a controller base, something that takes the controllers and makes them visible. And then the final part of the hardware is the mapping between the hardware controller and the input being emulated. So for example, if you had a switch in your left hand, that equaled pressing the X button. We consider that part of the hardware. Now, to just break down the hardware a little bit more, the basic idea is that you have a switch that plugs into a controller base with a 3.5mm audio jack. That talked wirelessly to the computer, and then the computer rendered the VR environment on the headset. In our case, we did it via a wired headset, but other people might do it with a wireless headset. So this is like the end-to-end of the hardware that we used. We had a lot of switches available. So to give a quick tour of a few of them, we had ping pong switches, which are very light activation force. They're like little ice cream cones that move. Very light activation force and multi-directional. We had proximity switches where you could move a piece of your body somewhere near the switch and it would count as input. We had button switches and contact switches and a squeeze switch and lots of other things available. These are some of the wonderful users that we worked with and some of the switches in action. So on the left, we've got a ping pong switch. It's the XAC controller in the middle. And then on the right, there's a lib switch there. As I said before, we also put them in lots of different places. So we had users who would have them attached to their wheelchair, some users who'd hold them, and other users where it would be placed in a user's pocket. We worked with a number of users who had lower limb amputations or single limb or single hand, like Carl. So then it was mounting it in a place where they could reach it, or ensuring that controls were mapped in such a way that they had a single-sided input could reach all of the controls they needed. So the second part of a control scheme is the software. Now the software doesn't actually know it's being triggered by a switch. It just sees an input like an X button being pressed. So the first step is just mapping the hardware to a specific pre-existing action within VR. So for example, pressing what it sees as an X switch starts the teleporting process, something like that. The second thing that we found ourselves doing was adding features to the environment in the software that were specifically for switch use. So a common barrier or a common thing that would happen, which again is more of a cognitive barrier than a mobility barrier, it's affected a lot of users, was becoming disorientated and trying to remember which way they're facing in the real world, the participant was facing in the real world and the virtual world, and trying to understand them between the two. So we offered a two-press reset. So if you had two switches set up, if you press them both at the same time, it would reset you in the orientation that you started in fade to black, move you back around. And this was really useful for users who had almost got lost on their movement and just needed a reference point to come back to. This really helped a lot of low vision users as well. So that's control schemes. That's what they're made up of. It's the hardware and the software. And now I want to talk you briefly through the three control schemes that we built and kind of what they look like and how they worked. So for these three pre-built control schemes, they were starting points. They were modified to suit each participant's needs. And we focused mostly on navigation and teleporting because that was the biggest barrier. We did play with interactive stuff, but I'm going to run out of time to talk about it, and we didn't play with it much. So this is the stuff that we're most interested in. What I'm sharing here isn't our recommended solutions. It's just sharing what we experimented with and what seemed to work. This bit isn't science. This is just us sharing what we've done. So to crack on with those. So we had these three solutions. So I'll just take through them one by one. The first control scheme was to use head tracking. So the motion controller was mounted to the headset using Velcro, which is what Ollie's doing in this photo here. And the control scheme was developed for participants who couldn't necessarily hold or orientate a motion controller, but had good head and neck control. We also placed this onto a user's arm for one user and onto a user's knee for another user. So really, we could pick up any point where the participant had enough motor control to take advantage of it. So a quick breakdown of different ways this worked: motion controller fixed to the headset, head-mounted display, and then a switch within the user's reach. The way that this worked is that the user would press and hold the switch to enter teleport mode. And as I said before, we created this latching and toggleable as well. So for users who wanted that, you turn your head to select a teleportation location. And then when you release the switch, it initiates the teleport. So that was the first control scheme that we played with. The second control scheme, which is fixed tracking. So for some users, there was no part of their body where we could pick up a motion input from. They couldn't hold a controller, or were unable to hold a controller, or orientate it using any part of their body. So what we did there is we rigidly mounted the motion controller to either part of the user's, like to the center of the user, so they could move their whole body, or to a wheelchair or walking frame or similar. Something that was fixed relative to the user, but required a whole body movement. And then it worked a very similar way, so similar sort of hardware setup, just this time the user's moving as a whole rather than just one part of their body. So this worked with press and hold again, so the user could press and hold the switch to enter teleport mode, rotate their entire wheelchair or body to achieve what they wanted, and then let go of the switch in order to teleport. Although this photo does make it look like they're farting out of their shoulders. So I should probably change that graphic. So those first two controls, they took advantage of motion controllers in order to emulate the same sort of control as was available to somebody who could use a standard controller. But for our third control scheme, we looked at using movement with buttons alone. So we called this rotation forward. So there's no motion controller in use, and the movement is controlled only using the switches. So for example, in this situation, we had the switch on the user's left would rotate the user on the spot to the left at about 10 degrees a second. And then the switch on the right would move them forward. And they could either be used separately or together in order to move around a control space. I've also seen some quite cool hardware that we didn't get to play with, when we did this about a year ago, which taps into the motions, the stick from a power chair and feeds it into an XAC as a controller input. That would have been awesome. That sort of hardware would also work this sort of way. But this is what we did. The way that you would move is you'd pick your direction by pressing the A button and rotating, and then press the B button or switch B to move forward. So those are the three control schemes that we played with, and we found them to be quite effective. Now, there was no single perfect solution here, and we weren't aiming to find a single perfect solution. And this reinforced to us that the most important thing about these sorts of control schemes is that they're flexible. The second thing is that needs change during a session. Users could become fatigued with a specific movement, or simply they prefer different movements for different interactions. We had some users who used both teleportation movement using a head-mounted motion controller and smaller around the room movement using the forward and rotate method. There is so much scope for innovation here. We've barely scratched the surface, but this is the experiments we ran, and we found it very illuminating. I couldn't imagine us doing any more future VR research without incorporating switch control schemes, because otherwise we're not getting a complete picture. So those are the parts of the deep dive, really. I've talked about how we collected the data. I've talked about the common motor barriers that we've observed so far, and some of our switch control experiments. The thing that I want to take away from this right at the end is that we are extremely encouraged. We had multiple users again and again telling us that VR was more accessible to them than real life. I feel sorry for Ollie, who did a lot of our facilitation, because we had to explain to users, sorry, it's the end of the session, and I'm afraid you can't take all the equipment home with you. And this is good, because way back at the start of the story, way back at the start of this process, we're saying that VR is the creation of these new environments and the creation of new barriers. It would be ridiculous for us to just replicate the same barriers that we exist in day-to-day life in VR because we don't understand them. So we need to think more broadly. We need to understand what the barriers are, and we need to work with other types of standard that we might not have before, like the British architectural standards, the BSA, stuff like that. But kind of, we need to do this. This is important. And from a BBC perspective, the BBC is for everybody. So we need to do this at the BBC because our future VR and immersive experiences are for the whole audience. And it's our job to find out to make it inclusive for them. When we get this right, we redraw the world and we improve billions of lives. That's the scale that we're working at here. And that's why we need to get this right. As I said, replicating the same barriers as we had in replicating the same barriers that exist in the real world in the virtual world would be a great disappointment, a huge waste of an opportunity. And by getting this right, we can help a lot of people in a lot of ways and ensure that the future is inclusive. So that's that's the deep dive so far. And I'm not quite sure how I'm doing for time, but I'm kind of ready for questions and answers.
Wow, Jamie, that was absolutely awesome. Thank you so much for giving that talk. There's definitely a lot of information there. And to remind everyone in the chat, like if you want to be able to rewatch this, we'll be having this up on the A11YTO website in a couple of days, and then it'll be available on there for about 30 days for about a month, and then it'll be up on YouTube afterwards. So I'm definitely going to be referencing this a lot. So kind of quickly, actually, Jamie, I wanted to ask, I know you had mentioned that you don't necessarily have any specific information for or research for blind users that want to be able to talk about, but I wanted to sort of ask maybe just if you can, is there sort of one piece of information that you found interesting in your research for VR for blind players?
I'm afraid nothing I can talk about today. It's not finished. I would rather say nothing than say something that I don't have the data to support. So give me a bit, it's coming, but I need to go back and I need to do the data. That's the kind of like the most important thing about this piece of research, which is it's based on the data, and I haven't finished crunching the data yet. I'm really sorry.
No, that's honestly okay. That's totally fine. So yeah, definitely stay tuned. I guess follow Jamie on Twitter, and we'll definitely have that information hopefully relatively soon. There was actually a question as well in the chat, or there was a bit of a conversation happening in regards to voice control. Do you have any information about that, and or like what are your thoughts on that in general?
That's kind of the same answer as before, really. We didn't explore voice control. We went down the switches route. Voice control certainly sounds very interesting, but I don't have any data on it. I don't have anything I can share. Sorry.
No, that's honestly, don't worry about it. It's like we're curious for this knowledge, and you see, and you're like you're the main guy to go to, which is a very good thing. So, and actually, you kind of brought up an interesting thing, and I hadn't really even thought about in regards to using the adaptive controller for VR. And I just love how versatile that controller is, and beyond just sort of the default sort of use of it with using sort of the Xbox console. Was there anything kind of that interesting that you had found when you started kind of working with the adaptive controller that was that kind of piqued your interest a little bit?
Oh, it's a wonderful piece of hardware. It unlocks so many options for different things. So kind of three things that we explored with. The first one is the battery life on it's really good, because no doubt we'd arrive at these test sessions and I'd forget to have charged something, but the XAC battery life was really good. The second thing is we really like the Velcro, being able to strap it to the back of a wheelchair and things like that. Being able to mount it with screws was very useful. Something that we wish it did that we ended up having to do in software is when we're using it with controls that are plugged into it, we couldn't find a way to easily disable those two big push buttons. So in the end, we ended up writing a piece of software to disable them, so that we could turn them off so that, for example, Ollie wouldn't bump into them or the user wouldn't accidentally nudge them with an elbow. But it was a really fantastic piece of hardware, and it talked to the game engine, and then we had a piece of software that dynamically could swap between different mappings within the game engine for different control schemes, and you could also layer them on top of each other. So yeah, there's quite a lot of software work to make it all happen, but the driver side of it was done for us for the most part. So that was very useful. It was a really great piece of hardware. Yeah, love it.
Very cool. So Jamie, thank you so much for the chat. And where can we be able to find you online?
So you can find me on Twitter as @Jamie Knight. We are building a website for this project, but like with a lot of it, it's on the way, but not quite out the door yet. And I think we're going to be building on these for future research as well. We're also looking to contribute to the W3C XR work and other bits and bobs. But for the moment, I need to hunker down and just get to the end of this bit of project, which in the middle of the lockdown has been a bit tricky. But I don't think I've ever been prouder of anything I've ever worked on. Like, this thing has been a monstrous piece of work, but it's been so totally worth it. Haven't got time to go into them now, but there's just so much delight and joy that we've experienced with users, and it really is encouraging for the future.
That's awesome. I am really, really excited to be able to see all this research come out. So once again, thank you, Jamie, for the talk, and we'll definitely chat soon online, okay?
Cheers. Bye.
All right. Cheers.